Nation, are you ready for crossfire?
Yes, I am.
Moderator?
Yes.
Okay, so I have a question about your stat with the Republican Party and their official platform about education. Do you believe that in a bipartisan country that a political party as big as the Republican Party can truly be representative of the majority of America?
No.
Okay. In terms of your statistics regarding how a minority of Americans have college degrees or higher education degrees, would you agree that that is a accessibility problem?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think that higher education, such as college, is the only place where there should be proper education for scientific phenomena?
No.
Okay. In terms of one of the last points you make about the necessity to have a complete overhaul of America's education system, media system, all that, you say that you're arguing that communication can't be part of that. So how would that look like without communication?
To clarify, my argument is not that communication can't be a part of that. My argument is that communication alone, which we define very specifically as the means of transferring information, cannot significantly alter these situations.
Okay. Additionally, you make a point that because certain communities, I guess these skeptics that we're talking about tonight, that they don't have contact with the scientific community, so therefore, if the scientific community improved communication, they wouldn't be reached. But is that not what communication is, that you would be finding a way to reach the people that you are not reaching?
Well, your assumption strips quite a bit of autonomy from the skeptics in terms of them rejecting the advancements in communication altogether, which is what my argument is about.
All right, so are you arguing that there are people who have no contact with the scientific community?
Yes, absolutely. By choice.
And you don't think that the scientific community trying to improve communication with these people they have no contact with, you don't think that would do anything?
No, because they would reject that communication on the basis of it coming from the scientific community.
Okay. Do you believe that there is no way to change the way people think, even after they have had certain beliefs after a long time in their life?
No.
Okay. I yield my time.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Scarpino, and tonight, alongside with my exemplary partner, Nina, I stand in firm affirmation of the resolution. Thus far, we have seen the affirmation demonstrate that there is a need for an improvement in communication, as systematic problems have hobbled our school system's ability to provide for students with fundamental scientific information. We have also demonstrated that there is an opportunity to improve communication through the rise in numbers of Americans listening to podcasts, watching documentaries, and visiting museums. And finally, the affirmation has illustrated a direct mechanism by which an increase in communication can combat skepticism. In utilizing a grassroots approach in which we cut out the political middleman and appeal directly to the individual, we take the first steps in liberating the scientific conversation from suspicion of bias and ulterior motive. The negation too has presented their contentions against the resolution, but far from refuting the affirmation's case, they demonstrate the necessity of the reform we are advocating for. The negation's first contention has two primary components. The first is that there is an ingrained culture of anti-intellectualism in the United States. However, we have already seen that this is not the case. More than 3/4 of Americans believe that higher education is valuable to our society. The average American reads 16 books a year, and the number of Americans listening to podcasts and watching documentaries has steeply and exponentially increased during the past decade. Regardless of whether these books and documentaries are strictly scientific in nature, they demonstrate the value Americans place on intellectual stimulation and provide an unprecedented means for the scientific community to directly engage with the public. Even the negation's own statistics ultimately support the idea that Americans are hungry for information, for education. They cite a 2019 Census Bureau report, which states that 42% of Americans have a college degree. But what they fail to mention is that when the Census Bureau first asked that question 60 years ago, that number was 4%. Over the past few decades, the number of Americans with college degrees has steadily and consistently increased across every racial and ethnic group. Furthermore, that same report notes that the number of people with graduate degrees has more than doubled within the past 20 years. And this is despite increasing financial burdens to education. Far from viewing education as something to be distrusted, more Americans than ever are seeking, no, fighting for their right to be educated. This nation is not fundamentally intellectual. There is a deep-rooted desire in this country for education. As the affirmation has stated repeatedly, the problem is not one of will, but accessibility. The second component of the negation's first contention is that scientific skepticism is a manifestation of anti-elitism. However, this is not a refutation. This fact is at the heart of the affirmation's case, and it is why we argue for an increase in accessibility. Furthermore, the negation never directly claims that our approach would be ineffective at combating elitism, but their line of argumentation fundamentally demonstrates the necessity of our approach. The negation states that education is a resource reserved only for a select few, but throughout this contention, they focus exclusively on access to post-secondary education. The assumption that education can only be provided under the golden seal of a university is deeply misguided and invokes the very elitist rhetoric that has led to the situation we see today. You should not have to pay $30,000 in tuition and attend university courses to learn the fundamental principles of science. If the scientific community is to combat rising distrust, they must fundamentally alter the way they impart information at every level. We can no longer blindly rely on educational institutions that have proved themselves to be ineffective at distributing scientific information. The scientific community must take up the mantle themselves. They must actively work to reach marginalized communities that our education system has left behind. They must recommit themselves to public outreach, to education, and ensure that direct access to accurate scientific information is available to all. The negation's second contention regards the distrust that certain minority groups might feel towards the medical community. To exemplify this, they point us to the infamous Tuskegee trials. Now, before we continue, I feel it necessary to mention that the medical community that existed just 60 years ago is unrecognizable today. Drastic improvements in oversight, regulation, and legally binding ethical standards ensure that those Tuskegee experiments would be impossible to conduct in the modern medical era. And the vast majority of Americans realize this. The same Pew Research study that the negation cites also showed that 92% of the American public believes that scientific and medical professionals have high or very high ethical standards. But when we look back at that heinous study, we again see the importance of what the affirmation is advocating for. Those victims were intentionally kept in the dark. They were not told the true nature of the study. They were not told that they were not being treated for their disease. They were not told that their suffering was preventable. The Tuskegee trials epitomize the vital importance of clear communication, of transparency, and informed consent. Now, the lessons learned from that heinous trial have by no means made the modern medical experience perfect. As the negation rightly points out, within the last few years, the medical community has become vividly aware of the discrepancies in patient experience felt among certain minority groups. However, the affirmation is not blind to these problems. The definition we have this evening characterizes communication as the exchange of information, and the scientific community must work to ensure that that exchange flows in both directions. As well as providing transparency, the medical community must also improve the way it listens to those in its care. They must become aware of their biases, place greater value in what their patients are telling them, and actively work to reform the nature of client communications. Such genuine efforts to listen, to value patients' experiences, are the first steps towards healing the wounds of history and decreasing the distrust and harmful skepticism we see in science today. The negation's final contention is that those who distrust science isolate themselves from opposing viewpoints. In an attempt to demonstrate this, they provide a series of statistics on the habits of those who lean conservative. The underlying assumption being, of course, that Republicans distrust science, and that Republicans are ideologically isolated. Unfortunately for the negation, both part of these assumptions collapse under scrutiny. It is dangerous to assume that political affiliation is a reliable indicator of trust in science. Republicans, just as Democrats, are an active part of the scientific and medical establishment. In fact, a meta-analysis conducted by researchers at Yale University found that registered Republicans comprise the majority or supermajority of practitioners in just under half of all medical specialties. This notion that Republicans are inherently anti-science is a dangerous, polarizing, and politically motivated attempt to diminish irreducibly complex people down to their party affiliation. And we on the affirmation will not stand for that. But even if we were to assume just for a moment that on average, Republicans are slightly more likely to distrust science than Democrats, the idea that they are ideologically isolated is verifiably false. The negation claims that 66% of Republicans report that their close friends share their view on government and politics. And while this statistic was technically true when it was reported, it is 7 years old. If we look at more recent studies, such as the one published by the Survey for American Life in just June of this year, we see that these statistics have flipped. 53% of Republicans reported having some or many friends of the opposite party. Only 32% of Democrats could claim the same. Furthermore, Democrats were more than twice as likely to end friendships over political differences than were Republicans. With these results, we see that it is Democrats and not Republicans who are the far more insular and isolated party. Science is not political. It does not belong to one party or another, and to claim that it does only serves to spark resentment and division. This is why the affirmation's third point is so important. In reforming their means of communication, the scientific community must disassociate themselves from the voices of politicians. It is only then that we can gain the full trust of the public and present a united front to the people. The affirmation this evening has presented a clear and consistent case. We have shown that there is a need, an opportunity, and an effective means for the scientific community to improve its communication and reduce skepticism. Furthermore, we have established that the negation's contentions only serve to justify the dire need for these improvements. The resolution we have this evening does not charge the affirmation with fully eliminating skepticism, only showing that we can reduce it. There may yet be factors outside the scientific community's control that contribute to this problem, but we must also recognize the role that we have played, the damage that we have caused by sealing ourselves behind the wall of academia, and we must work to reestablish a direct connection with the public. The affirmations approach is not mere words. We are suggesting a rigorous and systematic change in how scientific information is shared and taught in this country. Will it be easy? No. Systematic change rarely is. Nor will it be quick. This is not a problem that can be solved in the timescales of days and weeks, but of years and decades. But in a world where fact itself is under threat, it is the only means that we have to stand against the onslaught of misinformation, to be that great bastion of knowledge that we strive to be. We must undertake this long endeavor. And if we do, year by year, brick by brick, we will rebuild this nation's faith in its scientific institutions, its trust. We have no other choice. Thank you.